Hi everyone! I recently finished painting a preliminary study for a commissioned portrait that I'm working on and wanted to share some of the process that I go through from start to finish in this time-lapse demonstration. I've posted a couple of time-lapse videos before, but wanted to do something a little different this time. Instead of a shortened version of just a few minutes, I wanted to take some time to explain how I approach a painting from start to finish and to help answer some questions as to why I'm making the decisions that I do throughout the process. No two paintings are ever the same, so the approach to each one may be slightly different, but the foundational principles that guide your decisions remain the same in order to get the desired result that you're looking for. I also wanted to take a minute and thank everyone who has taken the time to watch the videos that I've posted here on YouTube. The channel recently reached a milestone by having over 1 million views, and I can't thank you enough for all of the encouraging feedback that I've received as a result of those who have taken the time to get in touch with me. To help celebrate this milestone and to thank all of you who helped make it possible, I've put together this video with the hope of inspiring others to pursue their passion for art and to strive to reach their own goals. With that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. So the first step in starting this portrait was to establish the overall proportions and placement of the head, but it's not anything that's super detailed because I know that as soon as I start to lay paint down, all of that initial drawing is going to be covered up. So I don't spend a lot of time doing detailed drawings, but just enough to give me the overall placement of where the head is going to be. So to start out, I will put in my darkest values first. And the reason for doing this is because it's much easier to judge your value relationships, or in other words, how light or how dark a value looks when compared to another value. The reason I don't use my lightest value as a reference point from which to judge all of my other values is because the tendency is to key everything too high in value by working this way. In other words, if I used my lightest value as my reference point, by the end of my painting session, I will find that more than likely I have a painting that's very light in value. In other words, I've run out of values. I can't go any lighter in value. I've exhausted my value scale. Whereas when I work from darkest values and work my way up the scale to my lighter values, I have a much broader range of values that I'm able to control. And so I just find it easier to work from your darkest values up to your lightest values at this beginning stage. And that's really what the block-in stage is for, is to establish not only the value relationships and to get some volume into your painting quickly, but to also establish the gesture and the overall mood of the person that I'm painting as well. So once I have that initial block-in down, then I'll go ahead and start refining and concentrating more on the drawing and trying to get more of a likeness along the way. And so as you can see, as I'm working, I'm not just staying in one spot all the time. I'm constantly moving around the canvas. I try to get the painting to develop as a whole rather than individual parts. It just seems to help me better and help get a better feel for the painting as I go along. Throughout the painting process, I will paint in certain features and then I'll cover them up and I'll go back again and it'll look like I'm painting the same thing over and over again, but what I'm actually doing is I'm refining as I go along. In other words, I am getting more of a likeness of this particular person. It's not just a one-time shot where I'm putting it in there and then just leaving it in terms of expression, but I'm really studying the face as I go along, and the more that I look at the reference photos that I'm working from and just recalling my initial meeting with the person that I'm painting, I can remember certain qualities and characteristics about them that I'm trying to pull out in the final painting. In other words, sometimes I might exaggerate a certain expression, sometimes I'm downplaying other things in order to bring out that personality and that character that I first saw when I met that person, and trying to capture that unique quality on canvas. And that's really what separates a good portrait from a great portrait. Every person is different, but I'm really trying to capture her unique personality and character. So in order to do that, I'm going to really start concentrating more on getting these shapes correct and getting the proportions a little bit better. And so trying to get a certain look or expression on a person's face has a lot to do with the eyes and the mouth, especially the corners of the mouth. It's really not just one single thing that can define an expression, but it's a combination of things. So as I continue to refine the painting, what I'm basically doing is adjusting subtle value relationships, adjusting slight variations in drawing in order to be able to better capture this little girl's personality and character. And that's really what I'm after. Getting the entire painting to work as a whole, or in other words, getting all the parts to work together, is, for me, the most difficult part of painting. You can get one or two areas of a painting to look good and get some interesting effects that you like, but in order to get the entire piece to work together, that takes some more work, and that often takes a lot more time in order to do that. I'll put the structure in there, and then I'll take it out, or I'll make it more subtle, or I'll start to refine it more, so that in the end you get a nice balance between the softness of this child's skin, but you also get the structure needed in order to read well as certain features. I should point out that one of the most important factors in deciding what colors to put down on your canvas is the temperature of the light source. In other words, is your light source considered warm or cool? And when I talk about warm and cool temperatures, I'm simply talking about if it's a warmer color, it leans more towards the yellow side of the color wheel. If it's a cooler color, it's leaning more towards the blue side of the color wheel. So this type of lighting is a little different than indoor lighting, because you not only have the warm light source of the sun that's coming down, but you also have the cool influence of the blue sky as well. I talk more about this type of lighting in another video that I've posted here on YouTube that you might be interested in taking a look at as well. But once you determine the light source, then really every decision that you make in terms of color is based on that source of light. So I look at it this way: if I have a warm light source, like that direct sunlight that's coming on top of her head with all of that yellow in it, my shadows are going to be somewhat cooler in comparison. Much of what I've learned has been a direct result of another artist named Joe Bowler. I had the opportunity to study under Joe for 23 years, and when it comes to color and light, Joe pretty much taught me everything that I know. And so all of the lessons that I share with you have come from him. And so one of the greatest lessons that I ever learned from Joe was that when it comes to painting, there's a warm side and a cool side to everything. So when you think in those terms, it's much easier to make decisions about color temperatures and warm and cool relationships as you go along. As I'm refining this painting, you'll notice that I'm using a dry brush a lot of times to soften these edges, and then I'll wipe off the brush with a paper towel and then immediately go back in and soften another edge and continue to do that. And when I talk about a dry brush, I'm just simply talking about a brush that has no medium or thinner on it. It's just purely a dry brush, and then you just wipe it off with a paper towel. So now that I have the overall values of the head established, I can go back in and start adding the highlights and my lightest values into the painting. And in this case, it would be the hair, that sunlight coming on top of the hair, the sunlight that's coming from behind the neck there, underneath the chin. And so I'll go back in and start to add these really light values. And in some ways, I'm kind of reserving those very light values until the end of the painting. I can actually still go a little bit lighter than what I'm putting down, but I've added a little bit of yellow into these areas, which knocks the value down just slightly. But if I need to in the very end, if I need one last value to be able to punch in there, I know that I have a slightly lighter value that I can go to. So it always seems to help me if I can reserve that lightest value until the very end. In order to create the illusion of outdoor light, I will often go back into the head and start adding some warmth in those planes that catch that reflected light that's bouncing off the ground back up into those underplanes, areas like the eye socket, underneath the eyelid there, underneath the nose, underneath the chin. Those areas are going to be warmer in comparison to the cooler colors that are on the top planes there, because the cooler colors are being influenced again by the blue of the sky, whereas the warmer colors underneath, those planes that are underneath there and that churn underneath, those are being affected by the warm reflected light that's being bounced off of the ground outside. So I'll go back in and I'll add a lot of times a color that's a little bit too warm when I first put it down, knowing that when I start to blend those colors together, it's gonna mute it down slightly, and it'll become just a little softer as I begin to blend those colors together. And again, just hopping all over the canvas here, not really staying in one place too long, but the more that I look at this, the more I'm starting to realize that the right eye there is not quite right. It's a little too far over to the right. When I say the right eye, I'm talking about the viewer's right-hand side. So as you're looking at the painting, the eye on the right-hand side there, it looks like it needs to be corrected, but I'm not going to go ahead and do that just yet. But I know that it needs to be addressed. And that's one of the things about oil paint, is that one of the benefits, I guess, is that you can actually just repaint a whole section if you have to, and just go back in and lose a whole section and be able to get it back again. With other mediums, it's not quite as easy. Watercolor, you wouldn't be able to do that with, and acrylics would be more difficult as well. But with oil paint, you're able to just go back in there and start correcting things if you need to. But I'll go ahead and address that in just a few minutes. Once I have these colors down, I've put some cooler colors on the top planes as well, accentuated those colors, and I'm going to just go back in right now and start blending all of that together with my finger. I do a lot of finger painting. You can get an extremely soft blend, a blend that you can't really get with a brush. I just find it easier just to go back in and use my fingers rather than trying to blend everything together with a brush. When you use your fingers, you don't remove as much paint either. It tends to stay on the canvas a little bit more and tends to blend in as well. Whereas when you use a brush, a lot of times you're not just blending things together, but you're also removing a good bit of paint. And so by using my fingers, I find that I'm not removing quite as much paint. And again, the whole key to painting children's portraits is subtlety. And when it comes to those flesh tones and painting the head, you really have to be aware of those subtle transitions from warm to cool and from one value to another. Again, just going back and refining the shape of that hair. When it comes to hair, there are a couple of things that I keep in mind when painting hair, and that's to look at it as a whole and not as individual hairs. In other words, try to look at it as a mass, as a larger shape, rather than trying to paint every single hair, because what happens is if you try to paint every single hair, it actually weakens the drawing. There's too much detail in it, and it actually loses the effect. Whereas if you paint hair as more of a mass, as more of a solid shape, it will hold together better. It will read better for the viewer as well. Some great artists to study when it comes to painting hair are some of the great illustrators of the past. Some of those great painters like Haddon Sundblom or Tom Lovell, Dean Cornwell, guys like that really could paint hair and keep it as one solid shape. So if you get a chance, I would highly recommend taking a look at some of those great illustrators of the past. All right, now I'm getting to the point here where I need to fix this eye. So in order to do that, there's really no easy way about it. So I'm just going to have to move the eye that right eye to the left a little bit. So basically, I'm just going to have to repaint it. If you ever get into a situation like this, when I first started out, I was devastated. Sometimes when I would get to this point and think, well, I've spent all this time painting, I don't want to have to go back and correct this drawing problem. And the thing is, if you don't correct it now, it's still going to be a problem. So the only way to really correct the problem is to face it head on. And when it comes to painting, that's really what I've found over the years that has helped, is to not be intimidated by the medium itself, by the whole process of painting, but to tackle those problems head on. I think about great painters like John Singer Sargent, Anders Zorn, Joaquin Sorolla, Cecilia Beau. All those painters were great painters, not because they avoided difficult subjects or difficult painting situations or lighting situations, but they actually faced their problems head on, and they overcame them. And a lot of times I will look at the works of artists like this, painters of the past, and see how they solved problems in their own painting similar to the ones that I'm facing in mine, and a lot of times that will help as well. So now that I've started to move this eye over, I can tell it's going to be in a better position just by blocking it in right there real quick. And now that I've moved it over, I can concentrate more on finishing that eye. And by moving this eye over, what it's going to do is help improve the gaze that this little girl has on the viewer and help to engage the viewer a little bit better. So now that I've moved the eye over, I am just going to go back in here and refine the values a little bit. And again, it's just a back and forth, very subtle process. So I'm going to go ahead and put these values in and then soften again with the brush and also my fingers. When it comes to painting eyes, I usually reserve finishing the eyes until the very end of the painting. I usually bring everything else up and then finish the eyes at the end. And by doing this, it helps me to gauge how much of a finish I need on the eyes. Do I need them to be darker? Do I need them to be more detailed? It all depends on the degree of finish that you have on the rest of the head. So a lot of times I'll just hold off until the very end of a painting to be able to finish the eyes and put those highlights in, making those shadows on the face slightly darker. Not too dark, but just enough to add a little more volume, and trying to get more of a roundness to the cheeks themselves. When it comes to painting shadows, especially in flesh tones, I always approach them with the thought that every shadow is a color, and not just a change in value. In other words, I don't just use black in my paint mixtures in order to make a value darker or to make a color darker, but I'm actually adding another color to a color in order to make it not only darker in value, but also a difference in temperature. So a lot of these shadows that you see on the face here, they're either going to be warmer shadows, which contain more orange or more yellow, or more of a cool shadow, which is more of a purple or a blue color as well. If you have the mindset that every value is a color, it just makes the whole approach to painting shadows a little more manageable. You'll notice I've gone back and forth quite a few times on painting that nose, especially on the left-hand side, because it's a very subtle transition that takes place there. There's really hardly anything there in terms of value changes. There are a couple of value changes, but they're very subtle, and most of the left side of that nose depends on temperature changes. In other words, from a cool color to a warm color in order to indicate what's going on there. It would be very easy to be tempted to paint that nose with a value change, a darker value change, in order to indicate where the side of that nose and the cheek meet. But if you do that, it won't look right because the value is not correct. So if you run out of values to work with. In a case like that, if you don't have a lot of value changes that you're working with, the only way to get volume is to incorporate temperature changes. In other words, warm to cool or cool to warm. So just something to keep in mind as well. Again, I'm just going back now and softening a lot of these edges, basically just simplifying things. And a lot of times I'll find that I go back in and edit a lot of those details out, basically just simplifying things in order to get it to read well. And actually, by simplifying a lot of the details, you're actually able to make a stronger statement because it mimics the way that we see things in nature. All of these little subtle changes make a difference, and right now I'm just trying to get a little bit more of an expression in her mouth. I talked a little bit earlier about painting the hair as more of a mass rather than individual hairs. Once you get the large shapes of the hair in there, then what I like to do is just to go back and add some wisps of hair just in a few key areas, just to create the illusion that it's hair, and it just suggests that there's a lot more information there than there really is. And really, that process of simplifying is extremely important because you don't want to paint everything that you see. In other words, there's so much information in your subject that if you were to paint all of it, it would be almost impossible. So what you're trying to do is to simplify the large shapes, simplify those values, and simplify those warm and cool temperature changes in order to create the illusion of a three-dimensional object. And ultimately, that's an editing process. So as I'm looking at this little girl, there are certain things that I'm choosing not to paint in, and there are certain things that I'm choosing to maybe overemphasize a little bit, whether it's the expression on her face, whether it's the turned up corners of her mouth, or whether it's the highlight in the eye. There's certain things that I'm trying to exaggerate a little bit, in a sense, in order to get the expression that I'm looking for and the expression that I first saw when I met her. So this editing process is extremely important because it's not just painting this little girl, it's really how I see her. And that's really what it boils down to for each artist. When someone commissions me to paint a portrait, they're not just commissioning me to paint a likeness of their child or of their wife or husband. What they're doing is they're wanting my interpretation of that person. In other words, how I see them. So, for example, if we had 10 different artists in a room who are painting the same subject at the same time, by the end of that painting session, you would have 10 different interpretations of that person because each individual artist sees that subject differently. So as I'm painting portraits, I think it's important to make people look their best. Some people look at this as flattery, but I look at it as interpretation. That's how I'm interpreting my subjects. I'm trying to make them look their very best. When it comes to painting shadows, especially in flesh tones, I always approach them with the thought that every shadow is a color, and not just a change in value. In other words, I don't just use black in my paint mixtures in order to make a value darker or to make a color darker, but I'm actually adding another color to a color in order to make it not only darker in value, but also a difference in temperature. So a lot of these shadows that you see on the face here, they're either going to be warmer shadows, which contain more orange or more yellow, or more of a cool shadow, which is more of a purple or a blue color as well. So now I'm to the very final stages of the painting. So I need to really pull the drawing together and really focus on putting in those accurate drawing details as well as dark accents and highlights, and just those little subtle details make a big difference. And once I put these dark accents in, then I'll go ahead and soften them a little bit, either with a dry brush again, or else I'll just take my finger and press on the canvas and basically lift off a little bit of that darker color, which knocks the value down just a little bit. When it comes to dark accents, keep in mind that dark accents are equivalent to highlights. In other words, the way that you can get a highlight to make something look as though it pops off the canvas or draws attention, you can do the same thing with dark accents as well. So use them sparingly, just as you would a highlight, because those areas are very important, because what it does in many ways is it anchors the whole head. It anchors everything around it. So the majority of your work, you'll find, is done in the middle values. That's why I spent all that time in the flesh tones inside the head here, not really finishing the details of the eyes and those dark accents until the very end, because all of those subtle value changes, that's where all of your time is spent, and that's where all of the work takes place. It's these highlights and dark accents at the very end which really nail everything down, but it's not where you spend the majority of your time. But it's extremely important that you get these areas right at the very end. I had mentioned earlier about one of the most challenging aspects of painting, at least for me, is to try and get everything to work together as a whole, and not just to look good as individual parts, but to have the entire painting work together. And in order to do that, sometimes you have to sacrifice in order to get other areas to work. So sometimes you might have to sacrifice in the area of color, or maybe in the area of edges or drawing or something, in order to get another part of the painting to work well as a whole. And so one of the most challenging aspects of painting is getting the entire thing to work together. So during this final stage, as I'm adding more details to the eyes and softening edges, I'm also trying to keep in mind where I want the viewer's attention to be. And in this case, I want the viewer's attention to be more focused on this little girl's eyes and facial expression, and to keep their attention inside the face. So as I'm working on this, painting the details of this hair, I have to be conscious of that and not draw too much attention to the hair, but be able to simplify and soften some areas of that hair in order to keep the viewer's attention inside the head where I want it to be. Now I'm going to go ahead and add those individual wisps of hair just to finish it off and to give the illusion that there's some sunlight coming down from behind her head. I'll go ahead and finish the arms and the dress here as well. I also need to introduce some of that complementary orange back into the dress in order to have it work a little bit better. And what that will do is not only balance out all of that blue, but it will also give the illusion that there's reflected light coming back into some of those folds as well. I'm not going to spend as much time on these areas because I want the head really to be the most finished part of this painting. And by not finishing the arms and the dress as much as I have the head, it will actually draw the viewer's attention more towards that head and to keep their focus there. It also mimics the way that we see things in nature. So as you're looking at an object, you tend to focus on one particular thing at a time. You can see other things that are around that subject in your peripheral vision, but they're not as in focus as the subject that you're looking at. And that's kind of what I do with painting as well. If you can hold some things back to a degree, like the background, or further it gets away from the head, the less it has to be in focus. If this were a 3/4 or a full figure, then it would be a little bit different, because I would concentrate more attention on the hands and the head. The head would be brought up to the most finished degree, and then second to that would be the hands, and then everything else would be held back to a degree. But that's just something to think about as you go along here. Now we'll go ahead and finish that dotted pattern on the dress. Not really concerned about making each dot perfect, but just to give the indication of what's there. John Singer Sargent is a great example of painting both patterns in dresses as well as jewelry. I've seen many Sargent paintings up close where he's painted a strand of pearls, and instead of being beautiful round pearls, each one is almost a square, but from a distance it really reads like it's a round pearl. I'm just going to refine where that shadow underneath the hair meets the flesh tones, and then soften that a little bit as well. Okay, I'm just about finished, which brings me to another question. When do you stop on a painting, or how do you know when to stop? And there's no simple answer for that, but there has to come a point when the painting is finished. So from my own point of view, I think a painting is finished when there's nothing more that needs to be said. So I've captured the expression that I'm looking for in this little girl's face. I've captured the mood and the feeling, and that's really what I want to say. So at any point now, I could go ahead and stop. So to go ahead and finish it up, I will add a little bit of a background color with a palette knife and introduce some red into all of that green area, and then just go ahead and sign the painting. Again, I just want to thank you for taking the time to watch the videos here on my channel, and I hope that they will be a help to you. And to also let you know that I am in the process of working on some new instructional art videos, which I'll talk about more in the coming months, but just to keep an eye out for those as well. Thank you so much again, and I encourage each one of you to keep on painting, and I wish you all the best in your art.